The air in the courtroom felt different that morning, as though an invisible hand had turned down the oxygen, leaving everyone just slightly breathless. People whispered in the gallery, lawyers shuffled their papers, and the reporters prepared their pens like soldiers before a battle. All eyes eventually drifted upward toward Judge Samuel Alito, who sat perched on the bench with an expression that was less about justice and more about strategy. He wasn't there simply to preside over order. He was calculating, measuring, and quietly planning a way to tighten a net around Representative Jasmine Crockett. What the crowd didn't know at that moment was that his approach would not come in the form of outright rulings or visible aggression. It would come in the form of words, carefully crafted and meticulously arranged to sound innocent while holding the venom of entrapment. Judge Alito began with a seemingly straightforward inquiry. His tone was calm, authoritative, but laced with an undertone that suggested he had already anticipated her answer. The question he posed wasn't designed to seek clarity but to corner. The phrasing carried an intentional ambiguity. If Crockett answered yes, it would imply an admission of contradiction. If she answered no, it could be spun into disregard of evidence. Either way, the structure was a legal snare, a trick that could leave her credibility hanging in the balance. For those in the room who had seen years of courtroom maneuvering, it was clear this wasn't a neutral question. It was bait. Crockett, standing at her table, kept her composure. She was no stranger to confrontation, but there was something different about this moment. Alito's voice carried weight not just because of his position, but because of the authority he represented. A Supreme Court judge engaging in this manner was a spectacle that placed her at a disadvantage. The air tightened as if the room itself leaned forward, anticipating her fall into the hole that had just been dug before her. Even the murmurs in the back faded into silence, replaced by the collective expectation of an impending stumble. But what made this attempt particularly striking was the precision behind it. Alito didn't wave his hand or display irritation. He dressed his trap in the robe of judicial decorum. His words were smooth, almost too careful, as if scripted to perfection. The brilliance of the trap lay in its subtlety. He didn't need to raise his voice or impose sanctions. All he needed was for her to misstep once, to trip over the invisible line he had placed on the floor. That would be enough to shift the entire trial's energy, casting her not as a sharp defender of truth, but as someone who had contradicted herself under pressure. In those long seconds after his question, the silence was louder than anything else. Reporters' pens hovered above notepads, waiting to record the exact moment she fell into his design. A man in the second row adjusted his glasses nervously, sensing the weight of what was unfolding. Even the clerks at the side of the room avoided looking directly at her, as though they knew the kind of moment this was, a crossroads that could break her footing or cement her resilience. Judge Alito leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers interlaced as if he had already claimed victory in this intellectual duel. It wasn't arrogance that painted his face, but certainty. He believed he had outmaneuvered her, just as he had done with countless lawyers before. To him, this wasn't about confrontation, it was about control. He wanted the record to show her faltering under his question, her words turning against her like a snake swallowing its own tail. In that belief, his composure grew almost smug, though he kept it hidden beneath the mask of judicial impartiality. The trap itself was structured around a contradiction embedded in previous testimony. Alito referenced a prior statement she had made, twisting the meaning just slightly, enough to shift its intent. If she defended the original statement, it could look like she was ignoring the new evidence he presented. If she challenged his framing, it could be portrayed as backtracking. Either path was dangerous. This was the kind of calculated move designed to end debates swiftly, to cement authority not through force but through subtle entanglement. It was not the kind of question that gave room for nuance. It was a loaded corridor with two locked doors, both leading to dead ends. Too many watching? It seemed inevitable that Crockett would be boxed in. Her sharpness finally dimmed under the weight of a judge's cunning. The trap had been laid with the precision of a chess master setting a baited move, and Judge Samuel Alito appeared confident that she would take it. The crowd shifted in their seats, breaths held, eyes fixated not just on Crockett, but also on him. They wanted to see if his calculated moment of dominance would play out as he envisioned. The power dynamic in that room tilted heavily in his favor. He held the gavel, the robe, and the reputation. Yet beneath all of that authority lay a dangerous truth. Traps are only as strong as the assumption that the other person won't see them coming. And in that courtroom, the silence was no longer just about the question, it was about whether Jasmine Crockett would recognize the snare before the jaws snapped shut. Jasmine Crockett didn't rush to answer. She let the silence breathe, which in itself was unsettling to those expecting her to stumble. Judge Samuel Alito had delivered his question with the confidence of a man certain. The net was about to tighten around his target, but Crockett's pause suggested something else entirely. She tilted her head slightly, eyes narrowing, not in confusion but in assessment. It was the look of someone who had been through enough battles to know when the battleground had been chosen for her, and when she had the power to move it somewhere else. The courtroom waited. Pens hovered above paper, Breaths stayed caught in chests, and a few people leaned so far forward they seemed ready to fall off their benches. Alito, from his high position, remained composed, hands folded, gaze locked on her, as though daring her to make the wrong move. What he hadn't anticipated was that she wasn't going to step onto the path he had laid. Instead, Crockett pivoted. Her first words weren't defensive, they weren't rushed, or even directly aimed at his question. She began by clarifying the foundation, what had actually been asked, and more importantly, what had not been asked. She drew attention to the structure of his words, not the substance, which immediately unsettled the balance of the exchange. It was as though she had turned the mirror back toward him, showing that the trap wasn't invisible after all. She calmly pointed out the ambiguity, not accusing him outright, but making it impossible to ignore that. His phrasing was designed to funnel her into a false corner. The effect was immediate. A ripple of surprise passed through the gallery. What they expected was a direct answer, perhaps a falter or a hesitation. What they received instead was a dissection. Crockett wasn't just answering, she was reframing, untangling the wires of the question before anyone else had the chance to notice how tightly they had been wound. In doing so, she turned the focus away from herself and placed it squarely back on the source. The judge's choice of words? Judge Alito shifted slightly, a subtle adjustment in his chair. It was not the movement of defeat, but it was not one of triumph either. For the first time, the carefully crafted neutrality on his face strained under the pressure of being exposed. Crockett wasn't shouting. She wasn't grandstanding. She was dismantling. Her voice carried calm authority, not defiance, and in that restraint lay her power. She acknowledged the context of his question, then carefully separated the misleading implications from the actual facts. Instead of answering yes or no, she built her own pathway. She explained what the record truly reflected, what her statements had actually meant, and why the supposed contradiction was manufactured rather than real. Her tone wasn't combative, it was methodical, almost surgical, cutting away the excess until what remained was clear and undeniable. The very trap Alito had set was suddenly visible to everyone in the room, and by walking them through its design, she flipped its weight entirely. The spectators reacted in small but noticeable ways. A woman in the gallery nodded slowly, realizing the brilliance of the move. A journalist scribbled furiously, not to capture her downfall, but to record how she had just dismantled one of the most carefully crafted questions of the trial. Even some of the attorneys present couldn't help but glance at one another, exchanging looks that admitted quietly what none of them had expected. She had turned the tables. For Judge Alito. The moment carried a kind of quiet embarrassment, though he worked hard to hide it. His intention hadn't been public aggression. It had been subtle entrapment. Yet here it was, stripped bare under Crockett.com deconstruction. She wasn't disrespecting him, nor was she challenging his authority directly. What she did was far more dangerous to him. She revealed the mechanics of his strategy in front of everyone, turning what had been a hidden device into a visible misstep. She leaned forward slightly, her tone steady, as she concluded her response. Instead of falling into the binary he had offered, she outlined the larger context that nullified the trap altogether. The way she framed it, the only contradiction was in the framing of the question itself, not in her words. It was a maneuver so deft that even those unfamiliar with legal tricks could follow her reasoning and see how she had avoided the pitfall entirely. In that instant, the narrative of the trial shifted. What had begun as a calculated effort by Judge Samuel Alito to corner her became a display of her resilience and skill. The onlookers weren't watching a politician caught in a misstep. They were watching a politician dismantle a judge's maneuver right in front of him. The trap had not just failed. It had been flipped so thoroughly that it reflected more on the one who said it than on the one it was aimed at. The silence that followed her explanation wasn't the heavy kind that signaled tension, it was the kind that followed realization. People were processing what had just happened. Crockett had not only avoided the trap, she had revealed it and then walked out of it untouched, leaving Judge Alito with nothing to claim but the faint aftertaste of his own failed precision. The weight of her words lingered in the air long after she had finished. What came next was not the usual back and forth of courtroom exchanges, but something far more deliberate. Jasmine Crockett began to lay out the evidence piece by piece, as though carefully assembling a puzzle in front of an audience that hadn't realized the pieces were already on the table. Her calm presence, paired with an unwavering reliance on the record, gave her momentum. She didn't just push back against Judge Samuel Alito's attempt. She transformed the moment into an opportunity to expose the frailty of the framing he had constructed. She reached for a folder, flipping it open with the kind of composure that suggested she had prepared for this very moment. Inside were documents that had been glossed over earlier in the proceedings, records that seemed ordinary until they were placed under her spotlight. She began by reading excerpts, not in a rushed or defensive tone, but with clarity. Each line she quoted connected directly back to the misleading premise in Alito's question. By carefully aligning the facts with the context, she dismantled the suggestion of contradiction. The supposed trap dissolved under the weight of evidence that could not be denied. The courtroom grew quieter with each passage she read. People weren't shifting in their seats anymore. They were still, attentive, as though afraid to miss a single line. She connected timelines, pointed to specific testimonies, and highlighted official records with a precision that drew an undeniable picture. What Judge Alito had presented as a coroner was suddenly revealed to be nothing more than a shadow, a construct that lost its power when illuminated by hard proof. Alito watched from the bench, expression tightening ever so slightly. He couldn't interrupt her. She was within her rights to use the record to respond, and every point she made was rooted in material already entered into evidence. He had expected her to dance around his question, to find a way to dodge without substance. What he had not expected was for her to use the moment to strengthen her own credibility while placing a subtle spotlight on his role in shaping the misleading frame. Her methodical approach wasn't simply about defense. It was offensive in its precision. Each time she presented a piece of evidence, she followed it with reasoning that directly countered the implications of Alito's wording. She did not call him out by name, but the effect was undeniable. Every word she spoke pulled the rug out from beneath his carefully laid strategy. The trap was no longer a hidden mechanism. It was a broken device left on display for everyone to see. The gallery could sense the shift. Where there had been anticipation of her faltering, now there was admiration at her control. Even the reporters, who had come ready to write about a misstep, began sketching the outlines of a different story altogether, a story about how a judge's framing had been undone by the very evidence he assumed could be twisted. The whispers began again, this time not out of tension but in recognition of the spectacle unfolding before their eyes. Crockett continued, her voice steady but layered with emphasis at the right moments. She highlighted how certain phrases had been taken out of context, and how documents proved her earlier statements accurate when read in full. She made it clear that the only way Alito's question worked was by stripping away essential context, and once the full picture was presented, there was no contradiction to be found. Her strategy wasn't simply to survive the question, it was to redefine it so thoroughly that its foundation collapsed. For Judge Alito, the moment was not just a setback, it was a rare exposure. A Supreme Court justice was accustomed to shaping narratives with authority, not having them redirected in real time. He could not dismiss her points without risking the appearance of bias, and he could not easily reframe without acknowledging the evidence she had just laid bare. His silence, meant to maintain the image of neutrality, carried a new weight. It looked less like control and more like quiet concession. The attorneys present knew what they were witnessing. It was not often that a carefully designed question by someone of Alito's stature was not only avoided but turned into a showcase of factual strength. Crockett's approach didn't rely on flair or theatrics. It relied on patience and precision, the very tools judges themselves claimed to respect. By using their own standards, she had not only escaped the trap but placed herself above it. When she finally set the documents down, the silence that followed was layered. Some were stunned, others impressed, and a few unsettled by what it meant for the proceedings. But one thing was clear, she had taken the very rope that had been meant to bind her and used it to tighten the seams of her own case. In the process, Judge Samuel Alito's maneuver didn't just fail, it became evidence of its own, proof that her resilience and clarity could withstand even the most calculated attempt to bring her down. The transformation of the trial was almost imperceptible at first. It didn't happen in a single moment of grand revelation, but in a gradual shift that everyone in the courtroom could feel. Jasmine Crockett, who had been placed in the crosshairs of Judge Samuel Alito's carefully laid trap, now stood as the commanding presence in the room. The gallery had gone from leaning forward in anticipation of her fall to sitting back in awe of her poise. Even the rhythm of the proceedings had changed. What was once a stage set for entrapment had become a forum for exposure, with the spotlight no longer on her vulnerability but on the cracks in the judge's maneuver. She didn't gloat. That was the striking part. Crockett didn't use the moment to lecture or to bask in applause that wasn't spoken but hung in the air. Instead, she stayed steady, focused, and deliberate. After laying out the evidence that neutralized Alito's framing, she moved forward with her arguments as though nothing unusual had occurred. That discipline only made the impact stronger. People realized she wasn't playing defense anymore. She was shaping the entire trial around her clarity, leaving Alito's attempt hanging unanswered, a shadow that loomed over his authority rather than hers. Judge Alito tried to reclaim the tone. He adjusted in his chair, restating the boundaries of the question, as though reminding the room that he still held the gavel. But the power of a gavel is symbolic, and in that moment, it felt hollow. His words landed, but they lacked the force they had carried earlier. Where there had once been anticipation of his authority, there was now skepticism. The audience could not unsee what had just happened. The judge had tried to trap her, and she had dismantled it in a way that made the trap itself the story. Crockett leaned slightly toward the microphone, her voice unwavering as she continued. She tied the evidence she had presented back to broader points, reinforcing that the case wasn't about rhetorical traps, but about accountability, accuracy, and truth. Every sentence she spoke underscored her composure, as though to make clear that no amount of maneuvering could dislodge her from her grounding. The room, once shaped by Alito's authority, now seemed to orbit her calm determination. The effect on the spectators was profound. Some looked at each other with raised eyebrows, silently acknowledging that they had witnessed something unexpected. Reporters scribbled notes faster than before, sensing that their headlines had changed mid-proceeding. Even a few attorneys shifted uncomfortably, recognizing the delicate balance of a courtroom had tilted away from its traditional hierarchy. It wasn't every day that someone stood against a Supreme Court justice's tactics and walked away not only intact but stronger. Alito himself remained outwardly composed, but the smallest gestures betrayed the shift. His fingers tapped once on the edge of the bench, a restrained tick of frustration. He straightened his robe as though reclaiming presence, yet it didn't carry the same gravitas it had when the proceedings began. He couldn't directly confront her without exposing the intent behind his earlier maneuver. His silence was strategic, but it was also confining. In trying to ensnare her, he had placed himself in a position where the best option was to say little at all. Crockett used the silence to her advantage. Without raising her voice, she laid out her position in a way that left little room for misinterpretation. She reminded the courtroom that facts are not flexible, that evidence cannot be reshaped to fit narrative designs, and that justice requires clarity rather than gamesmanship. The words weren't pointed directly at Alito, but no one in the room could miss the implication. She had flipped the dynamic so fully that even the judge's authority now seemed subject to her insistence on truth. The longer it went on, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about one question or one exchange. It was about control of the narrative. Judge Alito had entered the trial believing he could steer it, that his framing would corner her and tilt perception. Yet here he was, watching as the very trap he designed became the example of why her voice carried weight. The more she spoke, the more undeniable it became that the attempt to silence her had instead amplified her position. The gallery sat in an unusual kind of silence, one filled not with tension, but with recognition. They had come expecting routine, perhaps even a quiet defeat. Instead, they were witnessing a reversal so complete that it seemed almost scripted. Crockett's restraint, paired with her precision, had rewritten the story in real time. The moment was no longer about whether she could survive the pressure of a judge's question. It was about how she had turned that pressure into the very stage, where his intentions stood exposed. By the time she closed her folder and sat back, the room seemed to exhale. It was clear to everyone present that the trial had shifted in ways that could not be undone. Judge Samuel Alito remained in his seat, his expression carefully neutral, but neutrality after such a moment no longer looked like strength, it looked like retreat. Crockett had not only flipped the trap, she had flipped the trial itself, leaving the impression that no amount of judicial stature could outweigh the force of unshakable evidence and unwavering composure. The trial had wound itself into a rhythm that no one in the room could have predicted at the start. What was meant to be a moment of quiet entrapment had instead become the defining chapter of the proceedings. As the final statements approached, there was an unspoken understanding hanging in the air. The outcome was no longer simply about facts or filings. It was about the clash between authority and resilience. About what happens when power is wielded to corner and is instead turned back upon itself. Jasmine Crockett stood with the same poise she had carried throughout the day, her voice steady as she addressed the courtroom one last time. She didn't need theatrics. She didn't need to raise her volume or pound her hand on the table. Instead, she spoke with a clarity that cut through the silence, reminding everyone that the trial wasn't about clever traps, but about truth. She highlighted the evidence once more, tying it neatly to the broader principle of accountability. Every sentence built on the foundation she had already laid, methodical and impossible to ignore. Her words carried a weight that could not be dismissed. She reminded the room that attempts to distort, no matter how carefully crafted, unravel when faced with transparency. Without ever calling him out directly, she made it plain that the courtroom had witnessed an effort to corner her and had seen that effort fail. The facts had spoken louder than strategy, and the clarity of her record stood untouched. Judge Samuel Alito listened from the bench, his expression disciplined into neutrality, yet the stillness around him seemed different now. The gavel in his hand symbolized authority, but it no longer felt like the guiding force in the room. The trial had shifted, and everyone present knew it. His attempt to steer the narrative had collapsed under Crockett's precise dismantling, leaving the final moments weighted not by his words, but by hers. When Crockett concluded, the silence was almost reverent. Reporters had their pens down, attorneys sat back, and even the gallery seemed frozen in acknowledgement of the shift they had just witnessed. It was not the silence of uncertainty, it was the silence of recognition. The trial, which had begun with the expectation that she might falter, had ended with the undeniable impression that she had risen above every attempt to bind her. In the final gavel strike, Judge Alito closed the session. The sound echoed, sharp and hollow, more ritual than authority. People rose to leave, their minds not on the technicalities of the day but on the spectacle they had just observed, a judge's trap undone, and a representative's credibility strengthened. As Crockett gathered her papers, there was no visible triumph on her face, only the calm of someone who had trusted the strength of truth over the weight of power. The lesson was etched into the room. Even if unspoken authority could attempt to manipulate, but resilience rooted in evidence could turn the tide. What had started as a trial shaped by Samuel Alito's framing, ended as a testament to Jasmine Crockett's unshakable clarity. The balance had shifted, and everyone who witnessed it knew they had seen something far rarer than a simple courtroom exchange. They had seen the moment when a trap was